Uh, yes, what we heard, of course, we all recognize the first movement of the Opus 111, the last Beethoven Sonata. And I wanted to start with this as the crown, as the final point in the collection of 32 sonatas, as the final ultimate result of this uh, search, of this uh, place of experiment, of this, well, as the title of this presentation says, of this journey, of this lifelong journey of this composer. Hans von Bülow called this collection a New Testament. And he says that if Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier is an Old Testament, the 32 sonatas are New Testament, and we must believe in both. He was, on a side note, he was the first ever pianist to perform all 32 sonatas in a series of a few recitals as a complete set. I would like to probably go back and talk a little bit about history, just a little excursion, to set the time frame and maybe some kind of cultural stage for the time that we are talking about. Well, first, sonata. Sonata comes from the Italian word sonare, that means to make sound. And basically, in the beginning, what it meant was anything but cantata, which was the musical piece to sing. So anything that would be played technically would be called sonata. And it started a very long time ago, and there were two kinds of sonatas. In Baroque time, one of the famous known names that used this form was Arcangelo Corelli. And there were two types of sonatas: sonata di chiesa, sonata di camera. It's just, all of this is very interesting to research. And just to finish this, sonata di camera actually we can translate it as simply as a chamber music, and as any suite that usually was some kind of a prelude and a few dances after this. And sonata di chiesa was the form that Bach used as an example for 5 out of 6 his violin sonatas, violin and cembalo sonatas. It usually opens with some kind of largo introduction, then goes into allegro fugue section, then goes into some kind of slow movement of a sensitive, espressivo nature, and ends with the active, energetic allegro movement of a kind of concert style. So that's where sonata begins. And at the same time, of course, we know hundreds of examples that come from Scarlatti, from another line of branch of composition. And of course, we know this to be rather short, laconic pieces in a binary form, and sometimes in the end of his compositions, or from time to time, let's say, dispersed, we can see some beginnings, embryos of development here and there. So there is presentation of the material, then there is a little section from time to time in a dominant key, and of course eventually return to tonica and ending of the piece. Of course, it was completely redesigned in later years by classical composers, starting with Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. You'd be surprised. Bach, one of the most talented sons of Bach, the author of a very important book, which is called the Treatise of the Art of Playing the Keyboard, which was the go-to book of generations of musicians. Was highly respected by all those that we now admire, adore, and revere. Haydn says about his book that this is school of schools. Mozart said about him that he is the father and we are the children. And to finish this, Beethoven, when was agreed to take Czerny as his student, his first request to Czerny's father was to acquire the book of C.P.E. Bach and to study it from the beginning to the end, as there is nothing better than this school. So that was obviously an important figure in the history of music, and a respected and knowledgeable teacher and performer. He, as I said, started this redesign of the sonata and passed it to, of course, our Viennese classics, Mozart, Haydn, who developed it and made it up to perfection as the model to copy, to draw from, should I say. So by the time Beethoven was born, which happened in 1770, although he was under the impression that he was born a couple of years later than that. He believed, and there was nothing that would change his mind about this. He thought all his life that he was born in 1772. But indeed, he was born in 1770, we believe on 16th of December, into the family of musicians, of at least second generation, and his grandfather had his name, Ludwig van Beethoven, and he was a Kapellmeister in Bonn, where Beethoven was born. And Beethoven all his life admired him, although he just knew him first 3 years of his life. His father, a famous figure in Beethoven's life, not a simple figure in in his life. Was also a musician. He was a singer, and he was the first who noticed the spark, the talent, the genius of Beethoven, and of course, well, that's widely known fact that he wanted to make Mozart out of him, and made him practice day and night, and of course, the relationship was not smooth, to say the least. Well, this is all biography, and quite interesting. But I was getting into the sonata, development of the sonata, and the influences that were born and developed at the end of 18th century. So as I said, Haydn, Mozart, and the age of enlightenment, the century where Voltaire, where Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where the ideas of mind, of individuality, of rationalism, personal senses were prevalent, were leading the minds of people, of intellectuals, that to the end of the 18th century in Germany somehow transformed or drifted to the movement that was called Sturm and Drang, that is translated as storm and stress, and of course the leaders, or should I say the participants in that movement, or where it was a literary movement, but it had effect on all the art, and there is obviously an influence of that on Beethoven. The leaders and participants in this movement, of course, were Goethe, young Goethe, and Schiller, and a few others that I will not mention. But Goethe was always a very important figure for Beethoven as the symbol of nobility, as the symbol of purity and what would be the right adjective for this? Purity of soul, and so that was another influence on Beethoven. Now we come to the end of the 18th century, where Beethoven starts his music education. And by the age of 12 or 13, he already composes. And one of the first pieces that he ever composed were, interestingly, 3 piano sonatas. So we're talking about 32 sonatas, but indeed there were more. So he started experimenting. He started his life as a composer basically writing piano sonatas. He was famous for his ability to improvise, and we can feel it, we can hear it, and there are memoirs of his contemporaries about him improvising. And Czerny said in one of his letters that there was something very magical about Beethoven's playing and improvising, as he knew how to touch everybody in the room, and no one was left without a tear in his eye. So I guess that says a lot about this gift. The three first attempts, the three sonatas as the group, of course, they were dedicated to the Elector of Cologne, that was the ruler of this province. And soon Beethoven became an assistant to the organist, whose last name was Nefe, who became his first teacher and taught him basics of harmony, composition, and very soon realized that Beethoven needs to find a new teacher. And interesting that he was sent to Vienna in 1787 to meet and possibly play and take lessons with Mozart. And he went, and the legend says that he played for Mozart, and Mozart said to his friends that were with him that watch out for this young fellow, he is going to make a mark in the history of music. It seems that it's rather legend, and there's no proof that they actually met, as far as I know. And Beethoven had to leave unexpectedly because of family matters, and the visit was cut short. So he had to spend a few more years in Bonn working there, and somehow these years he did not compose. There was a break in that creative output for a few years until Joseph Haydn came as the visitor to the city, and of course, as the musical attraction, Beethoven was introduced and played for Haydn, and he agreed to take him as a student. In 1792, Beethoven goes to Vienna again, now to study with Haydn. And he never returned. From that moment on, his habitat, his area, his home city becomes Vienna, and never looked back. During his lifetime, there were several attempts that he wanted to go somewhere, that he wanted to change. There were sometimes difficult times in his life, that he wanted to go to Paris, or he wanted to go someplace else in Prussia, but it never materialized. He stayed in Vienna from 1792. His relationship with Haydn were difficult. We all know, again, it's another widely known fact that Beethoven had not an easy character, and his relationships with friends, with patrons, with people that supported him, or colleagues, were not always peaceful and quiet. So the relationship was difficult, was complicated, I should say. And Beethoven was not always happy with Haydn. Haydn was not always happy with Beethoven. He had to study counterpoint with Haydn. And he didn't really do much of the exercises that Haydn assigned to him. And Haydn didn't really correct some of mistakes that Beethoven did. So he had to have a few other teachers. And among his teachers were Salieri and a person, Albrechtsberger, who actually taught him counterpoint. Salieri was a teacher for choral writing. But Haydn, with all these complications, Haydn absolutely made an internal change in Beethoven's world, in Beethoven culture, in Beethoven's perception of music. He gave him all the richness, all the width and depth, all the dimensions of the classical style. And even without technically teaching certain rules, he taught him much more. And the results did not have to wait for too long. Beethoven, as early as 1995-96, published the set of Opus 1 of 3 trios, and almost immediately Opus 2, 3 piano sonatas. And here we start our count. It was a custom or tradition to, at some point, it maybe even goes back to Bach with 6 partitas and 6 French suites. And so the composers would release their compositions in sets. And Haydn would publish or release his sonatas by 6 or by 3. Mozart would do the same with quartets or trios. And so that was a tradition that Beethoven followed. And the first 3 sonatas, of course, with no surprise, were dedicated to Joseph Haydn. And of course, there is a story about this. There are so many stories that when I was preparing to this, I read a few books, reread, and read some new things. And there are so many stories that are worth sharing. So one of those that Haydn was expecting the dedication to be to my beloved teacher from student Ludwig van Beethoven. And Beethoven, of course, did not do this. Of course, he just went with Joseph Haydn, and that was it. And so here we are, Opus 2, 3 sonatas, and one cannot imagine 3 pieces more different than this. Obviously that was primarily for himself, so he could demonstrate his abilities, his virtuosity, his pianism, his temperament, his sonorities, and so there we go. The first one, he chose the minor key, which was already a surprise because if we look at Mozart sonatas, we find that there are only 2 in minor keys, and the big majority of Haydn sonatas are in major keys. So there was a tradition to stay with major and only rarely come to minor. Beethoven immediately starts with minor key, and sometimes we even call this first sonata a little Appassionata, which also happens to be in F minor. And this sonata, while being deeply rooted in the tradition of the 18th century and in Mozart, even the first subject of the sonata is a transposition of the first theme of Mozart G minor symphony, last movement, which is basically exactly the same figure, easily recognizable. And yet we immediately dive into the new world of dynamism, drama. As I was saying, Sturm und Drang, with stormy finale that probably there was nothing like this before, with unsettled, uneasy first movement. And the second sonata in the cycle, in the opus, is the complete opposite of this, with this loose texture, with the light and graceful finale, and with scherzando all over the first movement, and of course the scherzo. I have to probably mention one more thing, that the tradition, most of the sonatas before Beethoven, we can see are in 3 movements. And no surprise, all 3 first sonatas that he comes up with as his premiere, all 3 are in 4 movements. So he adds scherzo, which was reserved for the symphony. Right immediately he adds the 4th movement to the cycle of the sonata, and he actually stays with this model in many other sonatas that he will compose. I want to say a couple of words about the 3rd sonata before I will play a little clip for you of the first one. But the set of the second Opus 2 closes with, of course, the 3rd C major sonata, which in essence we can hear the quartet or concerto. It's not even symphony. There is obvious solo and tutis. There is the texture of the orchestra. There is the power of the orchestra, and it's highly virtuosic. It's a showpiece, and as the end of the opus, I think that serves this purpose. Before to go any further, I would like to play, I don't even know what time is it, I probably take too long, but I would like to play the first, a little bit of the first, beginning of the first sonata of the first movement. Let me get to this. Yes, of course, we all recognized Richter in his prime with this fantastic recording live performance. Yes, so moving on. After this, that was just the beginning, and immediately followed Opus 7, number 4, Opus 10. Again, number 4 stands alone. It's called the Grand Sonata, and it takes actually a very long time. It takes longer than Appassionata played properly as it goes, and it's a really powerhouse of the earlier sonatas, of the 18th century sonatas. I have to say that looking retrospectively, looking from our side, and looking and seeing all 32 sonatas or more, let's say, it gives us, in a way, the overview of the whole collection, of the whole legacy. But when we look from the other side, when we look at each sonata as if it was as if it was composed, that each one would be the last one at the time, and then each next one would be the first, we probably then would realize even better how incredible, how incredibly unbelievable leaps of imagination, of ingenuity, of freedom and experiment Beethoven would perform every time. That coming from, I wish we had time to hear some of his first attempts as in Bonn, so you could compare it even with the first sonata that we just heard. But each next sonata would really be a jump into the uncharted territory. Sonata was obviously, from the, as I was trying to say, maybe not very clearly and articulately, was or is a vehicle of thought for Beethoven. It's one of the paradoxes that I find, that we always think about Beethoven as a symphonic mind, as a symphonic composer, which is absolutely right, and that's what we should do when we learn, study any Beethoven piece. We have to imagine orchestrated, give some voices, to actually make a manuscript and an orchestral script out of any piece. Yet at the same time, sonata, piano sonata, his improvisational genius and his way of searching and thinking and making, well, I wouldn't say making experiments, because there is something unfinished in this, in my opinion, in this. And yet his sonatas are so perfect, so we cannot call them experiments only. They are also experiments in some way, but I think that they're so much more than that. He uses in all the sonatas, we can hear, so we can see and notice so many things, so many different genres and possibilities, as he uses marches, dances. He uses, of course, orchestral writing. Of course, he uses a quartet writing. He uses, we can see variations, we can see funeral march, we can see tarantella, of course, minuets and scherzos. We can hear concerto. we can hear a lot of different things over the course of sonatas. We see 2-movement sonatas, we see 3-movement sonatas, we see 4-movement sonatas, sonata form first movement, and variations first movement, variations in the last movement, fugues I didn't mention, which is quite quite an important part of this final transcendence in the last stretch of his life. Again, another widely known fact that usually Beethoven's compositions legacy is divided into periods, and there is one early period, and there is one where we are right now. There is one heroic middle period, maturity and power, and yes, there is the late Beethoven. The sonatas are distributed among those periods unevenly, and there's not exactly a border to me. Probably there is exactly a border to go to the late period, which of course comes with the Opus 101. But to really determine where the line is between the early opuses and that middle mature Beethoven is hard for me, is hard to judge, to determine, because at some point, well, every sonata is unique, as I'm trying to say. Everyone, I didn't mention some introductions, slow introductions and slow first movements, and so every sonata is unique, and like Pathétique with the slow introduction. Again, what was not traditional, was not customary. It was also more designed, part of design of the symphony, and rarely it was used in sonatas. So in his Pathétique sonata that titled by his publisher, talking about titles, all the titles in Beethoven's music, except probably for Pastoral Symphony, are not by him. So that's Emperor and Appassionata and Pastoral Sonata. It's all the creativity of his listeners and publishers and critics. Moonlight. Except for one, except for Das Lebewohl, Les Adieux, that of course is in some way a programmatic sonata, and has all those titles written by Beethoven with dedication to his patron, imperial patron, Archduke Rudolph. But this is all known. So going on where we stopped at number 4, I understand that that's very late, and I took probably too much time to get to this point. But I will try to make things move things a little bit quicker. Going on to Opus 10, which is again a collection of 3 highly different compositions, and again the first one is in minor, C minor, and then which is a special key for Beethoven. We'll see it. We don't know it yet, but we'll see, of course, with Pathétique, with Symphony Number 5, with many other C minor, with Concerto Number 3 compositions, that the key C minor becomes the key of drama, key of dynamic struggle. And so that is the first sonata of Opus 10, and then immediately he goes into the second sonata, which is humorous, light, funny, and elegant. And of course, the last one in that cycle is Grand, again, Grand Sonata, Opus 10 number 3, D major, that has, yes, and these first two are in 3 movements, and the last one, of course, is in 4 movements, and it's has this magnificent slow movement with so much expression, with so much intensity and pain that kind of predicts what is to happen. I want to move to another music example, and I have prepared the second movement of Pathétique Sonata. I found a wonderful recording of Arthur Schnabel, and I would like to play the beginning for you. The sonata, just a couple of words about this. As Opus 10 number 1, C minor sonata, loosely comes from Mozart's C minor sonata. We can probably feel the spirit, we can feel even some motivic relation. And Pathétique, so famous, so well known, has some roots also in C minor Mozart sonata, and at the same time it even has the second movement that I'm going to present to you, even has the motive that is very similar to the motive of the second movement of Mozart C minor sonata. But the first and the last movements of Pathétique have some resemblance and probably familial relationship with the Bach's partita, second partita, C minor partita. The rhythmical figure of the introduction is very similar. The second subject of the first movement, which is of course related to the beginning, to the first subject of the finale, is very well similar to the andante part of the opening prelude in if you think about this in the partita. So there are, of course, those connections and throughout history that kind of roll on and connect and give us the sense of continuity and tradition. So now with this, I would like to play a little bit of this wonderful performance of this immortal music. Just 1 second.
Smana is like very outgoing, compassionate.
Yes. Second movement. Um, moving on. It's hard to speak after those phrases and unfinished uh, movement, unfinished music. Um,
Hello, Shtarkman.
yes.
We are at 12:02 and have about 15 minutes, just to let you know if you wanted to continue or open up to some questions.
Well, I want to probably finish this. I understand that there is a limit of time. I apologize for not being on time, but
Not at all.
give me a couple more minutes probably to get to the end, and then we probably can open some questions. Thank you for letting me know.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So, as I said, from this point, there were a couple more sonatas that went in one after the other after this Pathétique. There, of course, a couple of smaller ones that Opus 14, then, of course, Opus 20, Opus 22. Which was the sonata that Beethoven was very proud of. And he said that this is the one that really cooks, that really is special. And he really loved it. As it turns out, at some point, in some way, in some sense, finished this 18th century, becoming kind of the ultimate result of that stretch, and from that point, from the next sonata, which is Opus 26, we can see that they're more experimental, they're more unique in form, in all kinds of approach. The next one after this, Pastoral, which was beautiful, which is mostly thoughtful, reflective, brooding, and Pastoral is actually not a bad title for this. But so after this, we go to the sonata that Chopin liked very much, number 12, Opus 26. The one with funeral march, and probably that was one of the inspirations for Chopin sonata, which starts with the set of variations as the first movement for the first time in Beethoven. Then what follows is then, of course, comes Opus 27, which is a collection of two sonatas, very well known sonatas, so inventive, so new, so undone before, that it could not even be titled sonata. So Beethoven had to come up with sonata quasi una fantasia, because the whole composition was quite without any example from the past. Both start with slow movement, both end with quite a significant finale that becomes the climactic point of the sonata. And I understand we're out of time, so I wish I could play the first movement of Moonlight, which is, of course, Opus 27, number 2. that has nothing to do with moonlight. I assure you, there's not even a hint of this. Somebody probably invented that to sell more copies or something, but it's quite opposite from that romantic sense of a night and song or whatever. And then at some point at the end of the 18th century, maybe in 1800, Beethoven wrote in his letter to one of his friends that he didn't really care for everything that he did before. And from now on, he will be a different man. He will be a different composer. And right after this, or relatively right after this, we have Opus 31, 3 sonatas, another set of sonatas. And again, it's hard to imagine anything more ingenious, more inventive, more unique in this set. Again, for the shortness of time, I probably will not talk at all about this, except that the first one is funny and as traditional, probably funny even because of this. The second one is when somebody asked Beethoven about some hints what it is. He said, read Shakespeare Tempest. And that's how it got this title, which is probably not word by word would be appropriate, but as a general sense of the theater, of the tragedy, of the drama, of the storm and water everywhere. Maybe that could help in interpreting this. And the last one is as graceful as, again, humorous and virtuosic as it gets. So these are this new declaration of a new Beethoven, self-declaration. And of course, again, for the shortness of time, I have to jump to the next stage, which would be really achieving something different, something even more grandiose in Waldstein and, of course, Appassionata. This is probably the climax of this heroic style, of this heroic period. And there was nothing like this, and there will be nothing like this. There was nothing like this before, and there will be nothing like this after those two gigantic columns that we look up to, and and they are of course polar works in terms of all the qualities, all the characters. If one is more energetic, positive, optimistic, and eventually moving into this beautiful and still active and energetic finale as the dawn. You know, there is a French translation, the title of the sonata, which means the morning star. That's another title to this. And as much Appassionata is dark, is struggling, is, well, I don't have to talk much about this. We all know these sonatas. And again, jumping, I'm sorry, kind of scrambling and not paying enough, nearly enough, the admiration and to this. Probably I need to get to the end, to the final skipping, of course, 24, 25, Les Adieux, Le Bévol, 1809, going into the lust and say a few words about this transcendence. I'm looking at these 32 sonatas, and I was thinking about this. We can probably even see kind of, well, 3 periods, 3 sections as exposition, development, where there are all these experiments, all these different approaches and adventures of Beethoven's genius. And probably we can probably think about the last 5 sonatas, starting with 101, 106, 109, 110, and 111. As well, it would not be a recapitulation, but it would be a transcendence and farewell to the whole genre of sonata. I think that that's what this 111 ultimately does. It's the departure from this. Everything that Beethoven, I think that he thought that he did everything that he could possibly do with this. And this 2-movement last sonata that we begin our conversation today ends in quite incredible way. And if we didn't know these sonatas were separate pieces that were written one by one during I didn't actually say, during 27 years from 1795 until 1822. It's quite a time span. We could probably imagine that this would be a more than appropriate ending of this, well, let's call it, at this point, let's call it this colossal, gigantic cycle. And well, since we're out of, even though we're out of time, I still would like to finish with basically what we started with. I'd like to finish with the last movement of the same sonata that we begin with. I'd like to finish with. I had so many more prepared for us to listen, and I apologize for this, but that I cannot skip. I have to play this for you to finish this conversation. So let's hear this, please.
Hey Google, play my whales mating playlist.
Well, I guess that
When you can
I
complete your
guess
room
that
with
is
free
the
delivery
end.
from the Home Depot, you have even more ways.
I apologize for all those extraneous sounds, and that I hope it did not disturb too much. I wonder if there is any more time left for anything else. If there are any questions that you would like me to answer.
Hi, yes, we do have a question, and people can contribute more as we go along with this. Also, you had a wonderful note from a Bernadette Martin who wanted to thank you for sharing knowledge with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So we have a question from Tom.
Apologize again because there's so much more that I would like to say and maybe quote and play, but unfortunately, as I said, I did not calculate, I didn't count, I didn't time, and of course it took longer than we all expected. I apologize for this. Probably we can do a second sequel to this.
Great. We have a question from a Tom Litwack. How do the Diabelli variations fit in with or relate to the sonatas?
Well, they relate to Beethoven, and they come after the sonatas, the Opus 120, and it's a great question, especially after this music that was just played as the last movement of 111 is variations in C major, and the Diabelli variations are variations in C major. And if you hear, well, you don't even need to hear carefully, you can see the quite a striking resemblance in the motive of the second movement, of the theme of the second movement, with the theme of Diabelli variations, which is quite amazing. What can be done? How can a theme like this can be transformed into something like we just heard? But I think that's the idea of variations, and I think that's the, well, I don't know what's the, I cannot say what was the idea. I can only say for myself. I think that this transformation from the simple, from the, well, I wouldn't say trivial, but simple, into sublime, into eternity, that I think is one of the probably ways variations are constructed in, especially in I'm talking about this particular case. So I don't know if it answers your question, but of course it comes as the ultimate opus for piano after 111. So that I can tell you without much preparation. Any other questions?
Yes, this will be our last call for anyone attending to submit questions. You can do so in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We do have a wonderful note from Bernadette Dunham. Excellent overview. We all wish there was more time to listen to your passionate discussion and knowledge of Beethoven. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wish there was a discussion, and as I said, with some kind of interaction, maybe it would be even more interesting. I if there are no more questions, I think that would be. I will try to read you a quote of Claudio Arrau, who made this statement for 200 years anniversary of Beethoven, when there was a celebration, which is 50 years, of course, ago. But I think that this is as contemporary, as relevant today. I will try. I wrote it myself. I wrote it out, and I will try to decipher what my paper says. But I think it's very enriching. So he says, for me, Beethoven has always stood for the spirit of man victorious. His message of endless struggle, concluding in the victory of renewal and spiritual rebirth, speaks to us and to young people today with a force that is particularly relevant to our times. In the sense that his life was an existential fight for survival, Beethoven is our contemporary. In the sense that he mastered both his life and his art to reach the ultimate heights of creation and transfiguration, he will last as long as man's spirit to prevail last on earth. I think these are very profound words, and they really special, chosen, carefully chosen, and I think they speak the truth. So with this, I think we can probably end our conversation today, hoping to continue and maybe some other time. Thank you very much.
We actually do have a last minute question that I think is appropriate with the theme of perseverance. From Yehuda Hanani, he wanted to quickly ask you, did Beethoven's loss of hearing have anything to do with the direction his music took?
Well, absolutely. And I'm sorry, again, there was no time to cover this, but this is a widely known fact that Beethoven was losing hearing. From what I understand, it wasn't instant, as we can imagine, that one day he went deaf and that was the tragedy. It was a gradual, difficult, painful struggle for him. And I didn't mention the Heiligenstadt's testament that when he wrote the letter to his brothers admitting suicidal thoughts, and he was only 32 years old at that time. He thought he was 30, but he was only 32. And that actually is a very interesting document to read and think about. But that made him, after this, it made him even stronger. Now, the loss of hearing, I have to say, Anton Rubinstein, probably in not a very sensitive statement, said that the losing hearing for Beethoven was a big tragedy and a big happiness for us at the same time. So that meaning, of course, meaning not being cruel and anything else, but meaning that this loss of external instrument, tool for accumulation, for the outlet of creativity, losing this and concentrating on the inside, concentrating on what's there, possibly made those unexpected and really unimaginable results, as where if we think where he started, even with these sonatas, and where he ended, it's quite unimaginable the range, the road, the journey, as we call today's talk, that he made, and the highest, the most sublime, the most transcendent, the most elevated and profound part of it is, I think, in the time, lies in the times when he already was losing hearing, seriously losing hearing, and when he completely lost his ability to hear around 1815, 16, or maybe even later than that. I didn't talk about many things. I didn't talk about the evolution of the piano, about widening of the keyboard, about pedals, about many other stuff, about left pedal, and of course usage of piano. I'm sorry, there are so many things that are left on the sides, but I hope that this talk, this subject, this topic will encourage you to go and probably make your own research to find out more for yourself, things that you can read in the memoirs of the contemporaries, that you can read in a large number of wonderful research books and biographers that actually started, biography started not long after Beethoven's death. So there are quite many books and materials that you could read and study, because it's really endless and very, believe me, very interesting. So of course, well, coming back to the question, Yehuda, of course it affected externally and internally Beethoven's music, of course.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a great way to conclude such a big, profound talk today. If we have no more questions, I think we will close for today. And just a reminder, we do have another talk this evening, and you can register on the High Peaks Festival website in the calendar section. That talk is at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much again to our guest presenter. And without further ado, we will close, and we hope to see you all with us next time. Thank you again.
Thank you and goodbye.